So here's what the official report says happened. Christmas Eve, 1945. A house fire in West Virginia. 5 children were asleep upstairs. The fire spread too fast. They didn't make it out. Case closed. Here's what the official report cannot explain. No bones were found. Not one. Not a tooth. Not a fragment. Nothing that would prove 5 children had ever been in that house when it burned. Nothing. And 22 years after that fire, a photograph arrived in the mail with no return address. It showed a young man in his late 20s. On the back, 4 words. Louis Sodder. I love Brother Frankie. Louis Sodder had been 9 years old when he vanished. This is what actually happened. George Sodder wasn't born in West Virginia. He was born in Sardinia, Italy in 1895. Came to America at 13 with nothing. Worked on the railroads in Pennsylvania. Made his way south, ended up in Fayetteville, West Virginia. By 1945, he had a trucking business hauling coal, a 2-story house on a good piece of land, and 10 children with his wife Jenny. 10 kids. Their names were John, Joe, Marion, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, Betty, and Sylvia, ranging from early 20s all the way down to 2 years old. George was known for 2 things: working hard and having opinions. Specifically, he had loud, furious opinions about Benito Mussolini. In a neighborhood full of Italian immigrants, many of whom still had family ties to the old country, George made no effort to hide how he felt. He called Mussolini a criminal. He argued about it constantly. He couldn't keep his mouth shut about it. And that got him into trouble. In October 1945, 2 months before the fire, a life insurance salesman came to the Sodder house. George turned him down. The salesman lost his temper on the way out. He said, and I'm quoting, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." George reported it. Nothing happened. A few weeks later, a stranger showed up at the property. Said he was looking for hauling work. There was none. On his way out, he stopped at the fuse box on the side of the house, looked it over and said casually, "This is going to cause a fire someday." The power company had just inspected the wiring. It was fine. George found it strange. He moved on. Around the same time, the older Sodder boys started noticing a car parked along the highway near their house. It sat there often, and the people inside seemed to be watching the younger children walk home from school. Nobody did anything about it. Nobody thought they needed to. December 24th, 1945, Christmas Eve. Marion, 17 years old, had bought the younger girls' toys from the dime store where she worked. She came home that evening and surprised them. Martha, Jenny Irene, and Betty were thrilled. They begged to stay up late. Jenny said yes. George and the older boys went to bed around 10. Jenny let the little ones stay up. Maurice and Louis, 14 and 9, were given one job before bed. Lock the front door, turn off the Christmas tree lights. Around midnight, the phone rang. Jenny answered it. A woman's voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know. Wrong number. In the background, Jenny could hear glasses clinking, people laughing. The caller gave a strange laugh and hung up. Jenny thought it was odd. She went back to sleep. Around 1 in the morning, she heard a loud bang on the roof, then a rolling sound, like something had been thrown and was rolling across the shingles. She drifted back to sleep. At 1:30, she smelled smoke. She went downstairs. The office area near the telephone and the fuse box was on fire. She screamed. 6 people got out. George, Jenny, Marion, George Jr., John, and little Sylvia, 2 years old, who was carried out. The 5 children upstairs, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Irene, and Betty, didn't come down. The staircase was already burning. George tried to go back in through a window, broke the glass with his arm, cut himself badly. The smoke drove him back out. He ran for the ladder he always kept propped against the side of the house. It was gone. He ran to his 2 coal trucks to drive one up against the house, climb on top, reach the upper windows. Neither truck would start. Both had worked perfectly the day before. He ran to the rain barrel. The water was frozen. Marion ran to a neighbour's house to call the fire department. No operator. The neighbour drove to a tavern and tried again. No operator. He drove into town and physically tracked down Fire Chief Morris. Morris had to start a phone chain, calling one firefighter who called the next. The fire station was 2.5 miles away. The fire crew arrived at 8 in the morning. The house had burned down in about 45 minutes. George stood outside in the dark, watching it burn, knowing his children were inside. There was nothing he could do. And then, when it was over, the investigators went through the ash and found nothing. This is the part that changes everything. 5 children, 2 teenagers, 3 younger kids. And when the fire burned down and investigators searched, they found household appliances, fragments of the tin roof, debris from the house. No human remains. Not one bone, not one tooth, nothing. Now here's why that matters. Bones do not burn easily. Crematoriums run at 1400 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 3 hours, and they still produce recognizable bone fragments. That's the whole reason cremated remains exist. The Sodder house burned for about 45 minutes. Jenny tested it herself. She burned animal bones, chicken, beef, pork, in fires at home. She found charred remains every time. A funeral director confirmed to her, human bones survived 2000 degrees for 2 hours. And And yet, 5 children, nothing. The coroner issued 5 death certificates, listing cause of death as fire or suffocation, with 0 physical evidence. The state police inspector ruled the fire was caused by faulty wiring. The wiring had been inspected and cleared just weeks before. And the Christmas tree lights. Remember how Maurice and Louis were supposed to turn them off before bed? Witnesses said they were still on during the early part of the fire. If faulty wiring caused the fire, the electrical system would have failed immediately. The lights would have been off. They weren't. Let me walk you through what investigators found when they actually looked. The ladder George ran for that night, propped against the house every single day, was found the next morning thrown into a ravine 75 feet away. Nobody moved it. Nobody had a reason to. When a telephone repairman came to fix the line after the fire, he examined the pole. He told the sodders the wire had not burned through. It had been cut. Someone had climbed 14 feet up the pole and reached out 2 feet to cut the line. That night, before the fire. A man was later arrested in the area for stealing equipment from a nearby property. Under questioning, he admitted he had cut the solder phone line, said he thought it was a power line, claimed it was a mistake. No police records of this arrest or confession were ever found. George's 2 trucks, the ones that wouldn't start that night, both perfectly functional the day before. Investigators never examined them properly for tampering. And in the spring, after the snow melted, 2-year-old Sylvia found something in the brush near the house. A small, hard, dark green object, rubbery, like a ball. George looked at it and said it resembled a pineapple grenade, an incendiary device. Remember the bang on the roof at 1 in the morning? The rolling sound across the shingles? An hour before the fire started. And then there's the man who threatened George 2 months before. The insurance salesman who said the house was going up in smoke, who said the children would be destroyed, who invoked Mussolini by name. That man sat on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental, without conflict of interest being raised by anyone. George hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley, and Tinsley found something that is one of the strangest sub-stories in this entire case. Rumours had spread that Fire Chief Morris had found a human organ in the ruins, specifically a heart, and had secretly buried it in a metal box. The story was that Morris had done it to give the family something to accept, so they would stop asking questions. Tinsley tracked down a minister who said Morris had confessed this to him directly. George and Tinsley confronted Morris. He agreed to show them where he had buried it. They dug up a metal box, took the contents to a local funeral director. The funeral director examined it. It was fresh beef liver. It had never been exposed to fire. Morris had planted a piece of raw beef liver in a box and buried it at the site, hoping the sodders would accept it as proof their children had burned and stop investigating. Think about what that means. The fire chief of the town where your house burned, where your 5 children vanished, went out of his way to deceive you into believing they were dead. Why would he do that? Unless he knew something. In 1949, George hired a Washington pathologist named Oscar B. Hunter to supervise a proper excavation of the site. They searched carefully. They found a damaged dictionary, some coins, and a small number of bone fragments. George sent the fragments to the Smithsonian Institution. A specialist named Marshall T. Newman analyzed them. His findings were strange. The fragments were 4 lumbar vertebrae, lower backbones, from a single individual. The bone structure indicated the person was between 16 and 22 years old at death. Maurice was the oldest missing child. He was 14. These bones were from someone older than any of the 5 missing children. And the bones showed no evidence of exposure to fire. Newman called it very strange that only these bones had been found after a careful excavation. He suggested they had likely been scooped up in fill dirt from somewhere else and deposited at the site. Investigators suspected they may have come from the nearby Mount Hope Cemetery. In other words, the only human remains found at the Sodder fire site were probably not connected to the fire at all. A woman who drove past the burning house that night told investigators she had seen children's faces looking out of a passing car. A car heading away from the fire. Not toward it, away. About 50 miles from Fayetteville, on the road toward Charleston, a woman who ran a roadside stop served breakfast on Christmas morning to 5 children who closely matched the description of the missing Sodders. She noted a car with Florida license plates in the parking lot. The children appeared disheveled. A Charleston hotel owner came forward years later saying that about a week after the fire, 4 children who looked like the missing Sodders had arrived at her hotel around midnight, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women who were speaking Italian. When she tried to speak to the children, one of the men stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in Italian. The group checked out before dawn. The woman only came forward 7 years after the fire. Investigators didn't take her seriously. George's own theory, the one he held for the rest of his life, was that someone had taken his children out of the house before the fire started. That the bang on the roof was a signal or a device. That the cut phone line, the stolen ladder, the trucks that wouldn't start, these were all preparations. Someone wanted to make sure that even if things went wrong, no one could stop them in time. In 1952, George and Jenny built a billboard. They put it on US Route 60 near Ansted and on State Route 16, the main road through their area. The billboard showed the faces of all 5 missing children, enlarged and printed in black and white. Beneath them, what was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or are they still alive? A $5,000 reward, later raised to $10,000. Drivers on that highway came to know that billboard. It became a landmark. People talked about the Sodder children the way you talk about something that never fully goes away. Jenny stopped wearing colors after the fire. She wore black for the rest of her life, more than 40 years. George told a reporter in 1967, "It feels like hitting a rock wall. We can't go any further." He died 2 years later, in 1969, without answers. He had spent 24 years believing his children were alive somewhere. In 1967, the same year George said he'd hit a wall, Jenny received an envelope in the mail. No return address, postmarked Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a single photograph. A young man, dark curly hair, dark brown eyes, strong straight nose, and an eyebrow with a distinctive upward tilt on the left side, identical to the way little Louis Soda's eyebrow had looked as a child. If Louis had survived, he would have been about 30 years old. On the back of the photograph, 4 lines of writing. Louis Soda, I love brother Frankie. Ill boys, a 90132 or 35. Nobody in the family knew what Ill boys meant. Nobody knew what the number referred to. Nobody knew who brother Frankie was. What they knew was the face. Jenny had the photograph enlarged and added to the billboard. She put a copy over the fireplace. She hired a private detective and sent him to Central City, Kentucky, to find out who had sent it. He was never heard from again. The family couldn't locate him afterward. Jenny never stopped believing that photograph showed Louis. She died in 1989, 20 years after George. She had worn black every day since 1945. After she died, the family took the billboard down. It had stood for 37 years. So what actually happened? There are 3 possibilities, and none of them are comfortable. The official version: the children died in the fire. Proponents point out that George kept 55-gallon gasoline drums at the property, fuel that could have made the fire burn far hotter than average. They point out that firefighters were still finding hot embers when they arrived hours later, meaning the fire effectively burned much longer than 45 minutes. And they point out that George bulldozed several feet of dirt over the site just 4 days after the fire, before any thorough search had been done. By the time the 1949 excavation happened, the site had been disturbed. Could the bones have burned completely? Maybe. But no serious forensic investigator has been able to explain why not a single tooth survived. Teeth are the most fire-resistant structures in the human body. They survive crematoriums. They survive plane crashes. 5 children's worth of teeth gone. The second theory: the mafia. George's enemies in the Italian community, people with old country ties and long memories, arranged for the children to be taken, used the fire as cover. The explicit threat from the insurance salesman, the man casing the fuse box, the people watching the children walk home from school, the cut phone line, the missing ladder, all coordinated. The children were driven to Florida or further, possibly shipped to Italy, raised by someone else. If they later learned who they really were, they may have chosen silence to protect what was left of the family. The third theory: someone came for the children who they trusted. An adult who knocked on the window or opened the door told them the house was on fire, told them to come with him. Children who would have followed without question, while their parents desperately tried to save them from outside. And 5 children who had no idea they were being taken. George Sodder died in 1969, still waiting. Jenny died in 1989, still waiting. Their daughter Sylvia, who was 2 years old the night of the fire and carried it her whole life, died in 2021. Her last promise was that she wouldn't let the story die. The case is officially closed, officially ruled accidental. No charges, no arrests, no answers. And somewhere, maybe in Kentucky or Florida or Italy or nowhere at all, is a photograph of a man with a distinctive eyebrow, postmarked 1967. 4 lines of writing on the back. Nobody knows who sent it. Nobody knows what the message means. The detective sent to find out disappeared, just like the children. On Christmas Eve, 1945. If you know anything, the family still wants to know. I'm The Archives. New story every week. See you next time.